No, you read that title correctly. What's going on, guys? My name's Innocence, and if you happen to be new here, this is my gaming/tech channel where I like to talk about gaming/tech. And on today's agenda, we're going to be taking a look at Jason Ronald, the Director of Program Management for the next generation of Xbox, as well as Phil Spencer, the Executive Vice President of Gaming at Microsoft, because these two individuals have been on a pretty interesting streak of odd interviews that don't make too much sense to me. And I'm not saying that just to hate, because I honestly feel that at this point the executives at Microsoft are not handling the underdog situation too well. And before we get on to what I mean, I'm sure some of you will be like, well, how do you know they're the underdogs and not Sony? You're just making a reckless assumption based on things that aren't fact. 12.1 teraflops is greater than 3.14159 teraflops and blah 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 blah. Well, since you wanted to go there, let's just go ahead and head over to Google. Okay, Xbox Series X reveal. Alright, pretty cool. December 12th, 2019 and 13.4 million views. Now, PlayStation 5 reveal, 28.1 million views. Yeah, over double the views in less than 1/6 the time. So Xbox, underdogs. Not trying to be mean, literally just trying to make an objective observation. But if you happen to disagree, feel free to let me know why in the comments. And now, there's nothing wrong with being an underdog. I mean, shoot, we watch movies about them all the time, and it's typically the underdog that does the craziest things to spice the situation up since they have nothing else to lose. The position of being an underdog isn't so bad and could actually have a tactical advantage to it, if you use it right, which Microsoft, in my humble opinion, is not doing. Now, I just want to say that I love the way the Series X is looking, and I'm also looking forward to the reveal of the ever-rumored Project Lockhart. But I honestly despise how Microsoft has been responding to the newly applied pressure by PlayStation, because it's been, let's just say, a bit far from grace. Now, for those of you guys who are dying to know what I'm talking about, there were two separate interviews conducted with Jason Ronald and Phil Spencer by Spanish website Xataka, I don't know, whatever that is, and Gameindustry-biz, respectively. And in these two interviews, these guys said some things that just make it seem like the entirety of the Xbox brand is just bouncing off the wall and trying to piece things together. It's like they're still trying to figure out what they represent and are in turn taking unnecessary shots at everyone else, which in my opinion is not very professional. But enough of my rambling, let's get on to the first interview, which was conducted by Xataka and featured Jason Ronald. This was, you know, supposed to be your typical run-of-the-mill interview that should have discussed features regarding the Xbox Series X, but as I kept reading, it quickly turned into a who could shoot themselves in the foot faster competition. For the sake of time, let's just read the part that I want to focus on specifically, but as always, I'll be leaving the full interview down below in the description if you want to draw your own conclusions. To continue, however, somewhere around the middle of the interview when Xataka asks about design philosophy and how specifically the Xbox Series X will be optimized for developers, Jason Ronald was quoted as saying this: "We could have used forced clocks. We could have used variable clock rates. The reality is that it makes it harder for developers to optimize their games, even though it would have allowed us to boast higher T-flops than we already had, for example. But you know, that's not the important thing. The important thing is the gaming experiences that the developers could build." And at first glance, some of you guys might read this and say, "Innocence, you're tripping. He didn't say anything wrong." But let me just break down exactly why what he just said completely contradicts the entire basis of marketing that Microsoft has been practicing up until this point. We were sold on the premise that the Xbox Series X would uphold the moniker of the most powerful console ever. And it's not like we made that title up. Microsoft has been plastering it all over every piece of advertising they could get, so obviously that's what we came to expect. But how do you measure the strength of a console? Well, intuitively you might say teraflops, and even though that's far from the most accurate way of measuring the performance of a console, it's still the only metric we have to go on until we get the devices in our hands. And I just want to preface this by saying that I don't agree that teraflops should ever be taken as an ironclad measurement of graphical power, especially in terms of video games. And as a computer engineering student, I'd probably get laughed at if I thought differently. That being said, it doesn't matter what I think, because Microsoft have already declared that teraflops reign supreme once they crown their console king. So obviously it would be within their absolute best interest to protect the reputation of the teraflop metric in regard to gaming, which we already know is not as legitimate as the media may have led you to believe. But sure, we know that, but Microsoft doesn't have to admit it. In fact, they shouldn't admit it, because if they don't, they could still walk away with their pride, as well as somewhat of a valid argument, because teraflops do indicate some level of performance after all. Now, let's bring that quote back. Enter Jason Ronald, who says this: "It would have allowed us to boast higher T-flops than we already had, for example. But you know, that's not the important thing." What? Okay, so some of you guys still might not be sold as to why this is ridiculous. So let me bust out the silent English major hidden deep within me and break this down even further. There's two ways you could look at this quote. A, using the first sentence as the topic sentence and analyzing it that way. And doing this, it still doesn't make too much sense to me. Let's read that first sentence again while completely ignoring the second. He says, "We could have used forced clocks. We could have used variable clock rates." This section, if you couldn't tell, is an obvious shot at the PS5 and its variable clock rates, indicating that whatever he's about to say in the rest of this sentence is targeted at them and anyone else who uses variable clock rates for that matter. Keep that in mind. The reality is that it makes it harder for developers to optimize their games. Okay, makes complete sense. What Jason is saying here is 100% true, and so far his argument is holding up pretty well. Having a variable clock speed does in fact make it marginally more difficult to produce games, so he has a valid point here. Even though it would have allowed us to boast higher T-flops than we already had, for example. And here's where Jason falls apart. Saying this indicates that Jason's intent behind this entire quote was to poke fun at Sony, stating that the only reason they implemented variable clock speeds was to gain higher teraflops than they already had. Essentially giving the quote a triple meaning. One, that the PS5 has quote unquote fake variable teraflops. 2, that the Xbox Series X has a true 12 teraflops, and 3, that the PS5 might have used variable clocks to boost their teraflop numbers while neglecting ease of development, or simply put, that PlayStation chased a higher T-flop number instead of making things easier on developers. Anyways, these are the 3 things that Jason could have meant when we look at the first sentence of the quote. So let's go through them each and show you why they all make no sense. Starting off with numbers 1 and 2, the PS5's teraflops are somehow lesser than the Xbox Series X's teraflops, since it will be harder, and that's harder in air quotes, to develop for. Now, in terms of what Microsoft should want, which is to constantly prove that teraflops are an ironclad measurement of power with no variation, this is a blunder, because it opens the conversation up and concedes the fact that teraflops can and will in fact be affected by other aspects of the system and should never be taken at face value. Which, fun fact, is something that both Sony and myself have been saying since Mark Cerny's Road to PS5 conference, where he is quoted as literally saying this about teraflops.
Here's 2 possible configurations for a GPU roughly of the level of the PlayStation 4 Pro. This is a thought experiment, don't take these configurations too seriously. If you just calculate teraflops, you get the same number. But actually the performance is noticeably different because teraflops is defined as the computational capability of the vector ALU. That's just one part of the GPU. There are a lot of other units. And those other units all run faster when the GPU frequency is higher. At 33% higher frequency, rasterization goes 33% faster. Processing the command buffer goes that much faster. The L2 and other caches have that much higher bandwidth, and so on. About the only downside is that system memory is 33% further away in terms of cycles. But the large number of benefits more than counterbalance that. As a friend of mine says, a rising tide lifts all boats.
And there, Mark Cerny essentially says teraflops are a metric to measure the computation capabilities of the arithmetic and logic unit of any given processor, not graphics performance. And this is where things fall even further apart for Jason Ronalds, because while Mark Cerny was taking a subtle shot at the Xbox Series X and its higher graphics unit count at a lower frequency, he provided proof and essentially hinted that the PS5 should not be slept on because of its teraflop count. Now, he didn't say that it was going to perform better than the Series X, even I'm not completely sold that it will, but he did say that teraflops are misleading and that the PS5 probably will perform better than its teraflop count leads you to believe. Now, if you're Jason Ronald and you did in fact watch this Sony GDC conference, What you shouldn't go out and do is concede your only point of argument by saying this, essentially proving Cerny correct that teraflops are not the only thing that's important, because the difference between Ronald's quote and Cerny's is that Cerny provided some metrics and proof as to why his argument is the case, but Ronald just conceded his main point of argument and argued that variable speeds are harder to develop for. Which, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it, also doesn't make too much sense. I know I've been saying harder in air quotes this entire video, but no, I'm going to be retracting that. In the grand scheme of things, variable clock speeds will not matter for game development, and they haven't been holding back the hashtag PC Master Race at all in the past 15 or 20 years. So yeah, while in theory it will be harder to optimize games, it's not a significant hurdle to leap over. So in total, all Ronalds did here was say that teraflops are not the end all be all, which again is not something you want to be admitting, even accidentally if you're Microsoft. And on to the third potential meaning behind Ronald's quote, that using variable clock speeds is just a quick and easy way to gain teraflop points while neglecting developers. Now, if you've watched Sony's GDC Road to PS5 video, you'd know that the main reason that Sony decided to implement variable clock speeds was because of the massive amount of complaints they received for the PS4 regarding thermals and fan noise. Sure, variable clock speeds do also offer a very decent boost in performance whenever temperatures allow it, but it's not like this boost will kill the development process, and it hasn't killed anything on PC in over 25 years, and I doubt it's gonna start killing consoles tomorrow. So that entire third interpretation, I just don't agree with at all. So going back to our original point, looking at this as the topic sentence for the quote just smells bad news for Ronald no matter how you look at it. And honestly, looking at the second sentence as the topic is even worse. Let's take a read. But you know, that's not the important thing. The important thing is the experiences the developers can build. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Ronald's here is saying that boasting teraflops is not what's important, but allowing the developers to create their vision, which does two things against Microsoft's best interest. Number one, it yet again takes away from the legitimacy of the teraflop unit, as well as pits them in a head-to-head battle against Sony in all other aspects that don't regard teraflop count. Which, if you've seen the absolutely bonkers specs of the PS5's SSD, you'd know that the Xbox Series X loses in almost every single category, again shooting themselves in the foot by switching up their marketing strategy last second. But enough about this, let's move on to Phil Spencer's interview with Gameindustry-biz, where he doesn't discuss teraflops per se, but certainly says some questionable things. In the interview, which again I will be linking down below for those of you who are interested, Game Industry asks Spencer for the reasoning behind Microsoft's choice on cross-generational exclusives, and whether or not the Xbox One would hold the Xbox Series X back. Spencer said this: "Frankly, held back is a meme that gets created by people who are too caught up in device competition. Gaming is about entertainment and community and diversion and learning new stories and new perspectives. And I find it completely counter to what gaming is about to say that part of that is to lock people away from being able to experience those games, or to force someone to buy my specific device on the day that I want them to go buy it in order to partake in what gaming is all about." And again, at first glance, this seems like a completely natural and acceptable response by someone as respected as Phil Spencer, but there are two major problems with it. The first being that Phil completely dodged the question. He said that held back was quote unquote a meme, which it isn't, and went on to explain why it doesn't matter if the Series X is held back, because you know, gaming is bigger than that. And of course, gaming is bigger than that. It's all about the ability to create experiences, but at the same time, Phil, the Xbox marketing team spent 6 months bragging about the massive power of the thing and how it'll be able to do things that we've never seen. And now you're coming out of left field essentially stating that you won't even be able to use the entirety of that power because the old consoles will hold back the Series X, but it doesn't matter because that's not what gaming is about. What? Like, do you see what the problem is? It's like Spencer is trying to be two different things at the same time, and it's not adding up. Does the Xbox want to be the most powerful console that brings new things to the table, which would require not being held back? Or do they want to be the console platform that exemplifies putting gaming above all else, which would require furloughing that power? You can't have both, or maybe you can and Phil Spencer sees a vision of the future that we're not seeing yet. But as of right now, it's just wishful thinking, and that's my first problem with this quote. My second problem is how Spencer tries to rewrite the cycle of consoles itself and elevate the Xbox brand to some imaginary high horse. And I mean no disrespect by that at all, but you can't honestly expect to call out all other companies because they believe in console generations and platform exclusives just because you've been struggling to create your own. It's the most flippity floppity thing I've ever seen in my entire life. Like, where was this energy when the Xbox One came out? You can't just attempt to elevate yourself to a higher moral ground for what on the surface seems to be like the betterment of gamers and expect people to blindly buy into it. Because reading this, it seems like this section was said more for the betterment of Xbox and not gaming as a whole. And if you don't buy into what I'm saying, let's just read part of it again. Spencer says, I find it completely counter to what gaming is about to say that part of that is to lock people away from being able to experience those games, or to force someone to buy my specific device on the day that I want them to go buy it in order to partake in what gaming is about. So essentially what Spencer is saying here is that the idea of console generations and exclusives is outdated and that we should try to be rid of it. But aside from what I mentioned earlier, this doesn't make too much sense because this isn't television, this isn't Netflix, and this isn't the cloud. Gaming is constantly evolving, and as gaming evolves, so will the technology that powers it. So of course we're going to constantly need new hardware to fuel it. This is where it differs from those online cloud services like the ones run by Netflix or Amazon, because those will possibly never need any substantial upgrades to your watching apparatus, because even TVs from the 90s are designed to run the signals that are still being broadcast to this day. There is no need to upgrade because no heavy processing is ever being done on your side of the image. But gaming is different. All of that stuff happens right in the console in front of you, so to say that generations aren't needed would be like saying that iPhone generations aren't needed and that every iPhone coming out from now should just be called iPhone. Imagine a world where every iPhone was just called an iPhone. No iPhone 10, 11, 12, nope, they're all just iPhones. And because generations don't matter, the newest iPhone will only be as powerful as the weakest supported device. It just doesn't make any sense. Phil Spencer, gaming is not the cloud. Stop trying to compete with companies that have no business with you, because trust me, they don't care. And what are game consoles without exclusives? Would PC gaming be PC gaming without CSGO? Would PlayStation be PlayStation without Kratos and Atreus? Would Xbox be Xbox if you could play as Master Chief on a PlayStation 5? Exactly. It wouldn't. Without exclusives, there would be no point in different consoles at all, which honestly doesn't sound like a bad deal at this point, but that's besides the argument. Listen, all I have to say is that in my opinion, yes, my opinion, the team at Xbox are handling this situation all wrong. As a fan of Xbox, I just want to see these guys put out some great games and shut up with all this marketing nonsense, which hopefully they do. I'm actually looking forward to the games event on July 23rd more than I'd care to admit, but again, that's besides the point. Xbox, we just need to sit down, buckle up, and make some great games. And that's all that needs to be said in this video. Don't get me wrong, I'm picking up my Series X day one at launch, and I hope other Xbox fans out there do too, even though I mainly play on PC and get all the games anyway. And for any PlayStation fans who happen to be watching this, don't worry, I'm picking up a PS5 as well and can't wait to compare all three platforms later this year. But that's enough talking, guys. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you disliked the dislike, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a future upload on the channel. And also hit that bell notification button if you're so inclined. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I've been Innocence, you've been the audience, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.